Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry to disrupt your conversations. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon on this rainy day. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown, but in the context of today's session, more important, I'm Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which along with Candles is one of the co-sponsors, as you know, of the Doyle program and of today's event. This is the 8th annual Doyle Engaging Difference Symposium. It's an opportunity we have every spring around this time to take up issues of difference and diversity, the issues that animate the program in the context of a wider campus conversation. So thanks again for being here. I know it's a very busy time of year. Just a word of background. This program has been and is inspired by the vision and generosity of William J. Doyle, a Georgetown alumnus who also serves now as chair of our board of directors. It's a campus-wide effort, as I said, to engage with issues of difference and diversity at the core of our academic work, in our research and teaching, but also at the co-curricular level and in outreach to the wider community. That includes the global community, and some of you who were here last year will remember we had Carrie Hessler-Radelet, Director of the Peace Corps, as our featured speaker. So Doyle, as we call it for short, is a collaboration between the Berkeley Center and Candles, the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, that brings these issues into our classroom and beyond. And over the last decade, when we do the math, and you can see some of the details in the various reports, we've really been able to reach thousands of students and hundreds of faculty so far. So learn some more about our programs. I encourage the students in particular to have a look at the opportunities for all kinds of engagement across our programmatic work. Now, our topic this year, as you know, is Dialogue for Engaging Across Difference. And I don't have to tell you much at all about the wider context for our gathering, about the political earthquake in American politics that has unsettled our society and indeed our community over the last several months, heightening tensions, and also generating a deep sense of disorientation and unease. I think you'll agree that times of tension and polarization like the one we're living through pose special challenges but also opportunities for universities. Universities like Georgetown that at our very core are dedicated to the free exchange of ideas, the pursuit of truth, but to those activities in a spirit of mutual recognition and respect at the same time. So some of the perennial questions that we address through the Doyle program, we have been addressing and will address into the future, are more relevant today than ever, such as, how do we build common ground across divides of culture, religion, class, race, ethnicity, and partisanship? And the broader question within which that question is embedded, a very difficult one, I think with a new twist, given where we are, how can we hold constructive dialogue with others? I almost said the other. You have to be careful, right? Others whose experiences, identities, and perspectives differ so much from our own and may even threaten our own. Very difficult questions. And as we know from recent incidents around the country, especially in college campuses, these issues are growing more salient. And I hope you share my ambition that as a university here in Washington, a Jesuit university committed to free inquiry but also to social justice, that Georgetown can be a leader as we try to work through these difficult questions within the academy and beyond. So thanks very much for being here. I want to thank our panelists, and it's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague Terrence Johnson, who will introduce our panel. And as he will tell you, this is designed as a dialogue, so there'll be a formal piece, but also plenty of time for interaction and dialogue with all of you. Just a word before I do that to recognize people that make this gathering and the Doyle program possible. In Candles, Eddie Maloney, my colleague, director of Candles, who you'll hear from later, as well as his colleagues, Jocelyn Schultz and Michelle Onona. And on the Berkeley side, managing director Michael Kessler, as well as Sarah Singa and Carly Henry. for their tremendous support of the program this year. Those are just a few of the names. Many of you have also here in the room contributed to our work in many ways. So now to turn things over to Terrence. Terrence, as many of you know, is an associate professor of religion and African American studies here at Georgetown, as well as a faculty fellow here at the Berkeley Center. He's an expert on ethics, political theory, African American religions, and religion and public life more broadly. Terrence has published widely, including a very important 2012 book with Oxford University Press, Tragic Soul Life, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the Moral Crisis Facing American Democracy. It sounds kind of relevant to today. Before joining our Georgetown community in 2013, Terrence taught at Haverford College. He has a Master's of Divinity from Harvard and a PhD from Brown, and did his undergraduate work at Morehouse. So please join me in welcoming Terrence and the rest of our panel.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome. So I will introduce our panelists and then ask them like 2 questions, and then open up for a broader conversation. I'd like to first introduce Professor Elham Atashi. Professor Atashi is an associate teaching professor and co-director of Georgetown's program on justice and peace. She has published on issues related to violence prevention, peace processes, reconciliation, transformation of armed groups to political parties, and indigenous and traditional justices throughout the globe. Let's please welcome Professor Atashi. Next we have Professor Marcia Chaitlin. Professor Chaitlin is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Georgetown, teaching courses on African American history, food studies, and women's activism. She's a recipient of numerous awards and was recently noted for her syllabus, #Ferguson syllabus, to encourage educators throughout the country to discuss national crises concerning Black Lives Matters and related issues. Welcome, Professor Chaitlin. Next, we have a student, Priyanka Dinakar. She's an undergraduate student at Georgetown, class of 2019, majoring in political economy. She currently serves as a research analyst at the Beek Center and is involved with events on campus pertaining to social justice, politics, and religion. Welcome, Priyanka. Shola Powell is an undergraduate student at Georgetown as well, class of 2017, double majoring in anthropology and French. She is currently a resident of Black House, is the president for Georgetown's Women of Color, and works closely with the Beek Center as an alumni mentor for the GU Impact program. She is a former participant in the Doyle Engaging Difference program's Junior Year Abroad Network. Let's welcome Shola, please. And finally, it's an honor to introduce my colleague, Reverend Jim Wallace. He's a best-selling author, public theologian, and commentator on religion and public life, faith, and politics. Reverend Wallace is the president and founder of Sojourners, a progressive Christian grassroots movement that advocates spirituality and social change in America. He is editor-in-chief of Sojourners magazine and a prolific author. Since 2010, Reverend Wallace has served as a research fellow in the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Let's welcome Reverend Wallace. So to begin the conversation, I thought I would turn to my friend and colleague, Marcia, to sort of give us sort of the historical context for this moment. And in particular, to give a sense of, the pundits and journalists over the last year and a half have been sort of scrambling, in many respects, to make sense of what they call the Trump effect, and trying to shed light on, I think, a reality that many of us have already sort of known, the sense that our nation is deeply divided, right, by class, ethnicity, race, gender, and sexuality. And I wonder if you could help explain how the Black Lives Matter movement, in many respects, sets the stage for what we see with sort of the Trump presidency and sort of the increase in racism, xenophobia, and sexism on a national stage.
I think that's a good place to start. So I guess depending on your age, this is either the beginning of a critical moment for you to decide who you are going to be as the world changes, or for others, it's Groundhog Day, in which you've seen this happen before, and it's disheartening to see that the changes and the activism of one period perhaps did not correct the ills that we thought it would. So I think that what we're seeing in the movement for Black Lives is a series of values that are similar to some of the issues that were raised in the civil rights movements of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but done in different platforms and among different audiences that I think have caused institutions to give pause as to whether or not this is a movement that they can join. And so I think what we're seeing right now with the election of 2016 is classic backlash politics, that this election was not about real Americans taking their country back, but rather a punitive attempt to discipline those who suggest that they too are citizens. And so I think that in the context of this election, what we can learn about institutional change is that if you were, one of the things that I say, and this is usually, I say this when I'm grumpy, but I do mean this, if you're trying to solve a problem, read a newspaper and then read a history book. And those two resources alone can help you understand what you need to do. And when I spend time on other college campuses, I'm always surprised by the number of people who are surprised that the types of questions or the types of requests that students are making in 2017 mirror the same kind of requests that they were making in 1967 or 1968 or 1970 or 1987. I think part of the challenge is how do we institutionalize forms of justice but still continue to realize that those mechanisms not only need revisiting, but they also need to be supported in a way that they can teach us something new at every moment. And so I think that we're struggling right now with, this is the last thing I'm going to say, because I could do this forever. The last thing I'm going to say about this election was not a reflection of the failure of our democracy or the failure of the electorate. Rather, it shows us the durability and the sustainability of white supremacy. And if we understand that, then our approaches to thinking about the impact of this election are radically different.
So I'm wondering, Priyanka, how would you then bring this to sort of the Georgetown stage? How would you characterize the political climate among Georgetown students since the Trump election? Are students more or less inclined to discuss contentious issues with their peers who might have opposing points of view?
Yeah, sure. So to speak to the campus political climate, I definitely think people are much more staunch and unrelenting in their views, and that further echoes the division on the Hill. I do think a lot of people are definitely more involved, at least post-inauguration, with a lot of relevant issues that resonate with them. I think Women's March was a perfect example of that. So much of this college campus really mobilized, and so many people attended this march. Not many people had really had much experience with protesting before, so I think that's something that this election has really brought about. To speak to whether people are more or less inclined to discussing with people of opposing views, people are definitely less likely to discuss with people of opposing viewpoints, but also less likely to discuss at all. People in general are more likely to associate with people of like minds, discuss their own opinions, and also be validated in those opinions. It's also important to remember that this could be because people simply don't want to hear differing views, or because these views can be personally threatening to hear, as something Dr. Bantoff was mentioning earlier. It's also important to draw the distinction between post-election and post-inauguration, because I think post-election a lot of people were quite emotional on both sides. But post-inauguration, a lot of Trump supporters, I'd say, are a lot more subdued, either because they're unhappy or possibly because they're unhappy with the way that the current administration is going. And also because a lot of people that did not support Trump and supported Hillary were quite diverse. So it's a bit hard for people to come together because of that. So to tie all that together, something I've been wondering is what is so new about these contentious issues that they're so difficult to hear? Because as Professor Chatelain was saying, a lot of the struggles from 2017 were heard in 1967 as well.
No, thank you. And Shola, I'm curious. I mean, this is a very difficult issue, both I think for professors and for staff to try to navigate. What do we do with our students? And I'm curious, what do you expect from the professor in the classroom? I mean, do you want us to remain neutral, or should we bring a quote social justice orientation to the classroom? And what do you think are the implications of either model?
Well, I think that the classroom is supposed to be and is designed to be a place to engage conversation, engage new ideas, and from that perspective, I do think the professor has a responsibility to bring that to the conversation and bring that to the forefront. I think in higher education, often we get stuck in like a very theoretical world where we talk about theories and practices that happen all the way out there, and this stays in the classroom as though students don't have to leave the classroom and they don't have to live in a world where these policies and actions that the administration is having a real effect on their lives. So I think professors and faculty and staff have a responsibility to actually discuss those issues with their students. In terms of bringing their own political views into it, I think that's where it gets tricky, and I think that professors particularly get very nervous about kind of implanting and imprinting their own personal views. I think you have a responsibility to do what is right. I think certain issues are not a Democratic or Republican point of view. Black Lives Matter is a very political statement, but it shouldn't be, because Black Lives Matter, whether you're Republican or Democratic. And so those types of conversations need to be had in a very professional manner. I think there's a way to go about it that can be very balanced. I think you can pose those kinds of questions to the class, and it's, I think, the professor's responsibility to be a moderator in that conversation and to make sure that it doesn't become one perspective attacking another perspective, because I think students feel very at risk in those kinds of situations, particularly if they are the only one of a certain point of view. I think also we also need to acknowledge that not all professors have job security in terms of bringing these to the forefront, and not all programs have like a department or have the funding or have the staff or the support from the institution to be able to have those conversations safely in the classroom and not worry about will they be invited back to teach another class. So I think the institution, as Georgetown particularly, has a responsibility to also guarantee that safe space for their professors, their staff, and their students.
No, thank you. And part of the issue, Reverend Jim, is this idea of, I think, of truth in terms of as we try to, mediate discussions, often people want to know, well, is there a truth to which I should appeal? And this brings in, I think, the role of religion. And as you well know, 20 years ago, religion was sort of characterized as a conversation stopper, by our liberal philosopher Richard Rorty. And I'm wondering, in light of the religious underpinnings of, say, current debates around immigration, current debates around the Muslim travel ban, what role, if any, should religion play in shaping the conversations around immigration and around these very difficult issues that affect us all in very different ways?
Well, the course I teach here at Georgetown now is called Faith and Politics. This is called Faith, Race, and Politics. And I always go around the room and I ask students why they're there. The Kennedy schools where I started this course, the first time I went around, I always tell this story in my class. The most religious student in the class turned out to be a very devout young man from a black church. He said, at the Kennedy School of Government, he said, I'm here because of my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and this course of glory to God, hallelujah, at the Kennedy School. The woman next to him, who was going to speak next, we could all hear under her breath saying, oh, shit. She said, I'm a feminist, lesbian, agnostic. I'm here to give this one last chance. And they became great friends over the time of the course. The question is, Tom talked about being civil, but then being a Jesuit school. How do you raise religious claims? Wednesday on the Hill, we had a broad group of faith leaders there to say a budget is a moral document as a statement, a religious claim. There are African American church leaders and Hispanic, but the Catholic bishops were also supportive. The evangelicals were there. Because when you cut Meals on Wheels and Medicaid to build tanks, we're saying that's a religious issue, not just a political one. So as you know, there's this movement rising up around the country called the Matthew 25 Pledge. This is the text where Jesus says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, I was sick. As you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Well, that text is rising up to protect right now undocumented people who are in great danger, living in daily fear. 47% of Hispanics in this country are afraid of somebody in their family being deported. About young African Americans and people of color being policed, as black pastors say, the hammer's going to come down, being policed without any accountability from this town. And then Muslims who don't know how they belong anymore. So this movement is gathering momentum around a text, which is interesting. The text that actually brought me from being a secular activist to my faith a long time ago. So when Matthew 25 rises up as a text in movements building underground railroads and supporting Black Lives Matter, which, by the way, is not just a very hopeful movement, but Black Lives Matter, in my view, is a theological statement against the founding principle of this country, which was indigenous and black lives don't matter. And so all of a sudden the movement becomes something goes to the heart of the nation's politics. And Marcy is right, this new presidency, it's not just the Trump voters and Tea Party people and Bernie people, but Black Lives Matter is also challenging the system. The system is rigged, is broken. So the blow it up constituency is very broad. And so how do you tie together, not just how to be nicer to each other in class, but how do you tie together the interests of white working class people who have been disenfranchised with young African Americans who've been disenfranchised systematically for years? Is there a political movement that ties economics and race together? That's what I think we should talk about going forward.
Thank you. Elham, I'm curious in terms of, how would you recommend the university as an institution respond, particularly a Jesuit school like Georgetown, respond to this sort of moment in history? I mean, you've dealt with sort of, the trauma of rebuilding countries and negotiating, and I'm curious, if Georgetown remains committed to its social justice sort of platform, I would argue that commitment may mean that you may oppose certain points of view. And I'm wondering, is it the role of the university to come out and have that kind of position and say, well, we are committed to social justice, so therefore we oppose, say, certain Trump supporters or the Republican Party based on their platform? So one, what is the role? And two, how would you advise, administrators in terms of how to negotiate among students this social justice kind of commitment, and how then do you implement it in a way that speaks to all of the deep commitments that we have?
Great, and I'll try to answer all the parts of that question. So I'm going to start with the role of universities. Historically and traditionally, when you think of a university as an institution, I think most people just think of a university as a space, as a place that imparts knowledge on students. But I think as a social force, the institute that has become known as the University of Higher Education has also been a space of either resistance, right, as well as conformity. But it has also been a space where it socializes students. So I think a more significant question that we could be asking is that what is the goal of this socialization? Now, I would argue that in the past decade, many people would answer the goal of this socialization is that to view the university as an extension of the market force. Our goal is to prepare students and provide them with the kind of knowledge that they can get jobs after they graduate, right? But there's also a different model that says, well, if you look at the university as a space and a place, right, other than its role of preparing our students for the market force, it also has to prepare them for the realities of entering a social world after the time that they graduate. And for that, I think we need to view universities more from the perspective of their democratization force, right, as spaces of democratization. And for that, I think we could be doing more to prepare students how to engage with one another, right, how to view university not just as a place that prepares students for the market forces, but also how to get them to exchange views with one another, how to debate with one another, but move those debates more with the goal of exchange that becomes more dialogue focused, right? And when you start to view this transformation that's taking place from a debate to a dialogue, you have a very, very different perspective, right? And this is the angle of the social justice that you were arguing. Where's the space of that? From that perspective, I think what we're seeing and what we should be seeing more of is that students are not just in a zero-sum game and standing in their position of either Democrats or Republicans or, with these very position-based arguments that they're making. But a dialogue is a process that's about relationships. Once you focus on the role of relationships, what you will see happening in the classrooms and the challenges that students have is that I'm not going to engage with you. Disengagement is very easy, right? Uninviting guest speakers that have perspectives that we don't agree with is very easy. Engaging is actually much more challenging, right? So what we're likely to see if we think of universities in these spaces of democratization is that once individuals become committed to repairing what they consider to have been broken relationships, rather than just focusing on positions of who they are ideologically, right? To think of ourselves as being in relationships that have somehow are in need of certain repairing that has taken place. Then the goal changes, it shifts, right? You're never going to have a debate in which you're going to have people of opposing views that are going to walk away from the debate agreeing with one another because they changed each other's minds, right? So the kind of thing that we're looking for when we talk about dialogue is when you begin to shift and see a transformation of people engaging with one another that are transformed in their hearts, not in their minds, right? Not in their position, but in their interests, right? As moving forward together and their vision for what they would like to see in the United States.
No, thank you. And I'm wondering, Marcia, as a historian, in some ways you carry a different kind of weight because of how society measures historians versus, say, philosophers. But I'm curious, and that's maybe my own bias, but I'm curious in terms of how would you actually inform or instruct students to say, to look at history and to understand the historical context of a particular moment and still and read that alongside contemporary issues. Like, for example, people have compared this moment to, say, the Reconstruction. And there's some folk who are saying, well, maybe that's misreading because you're simply using the Reconstruction to justify your current belief system. So I'm wondering, as a historian, how do you balance that sort of wanting to use history as evidence, but also not using history to simply justify your position?
Well, if I could just, I'm going to answer the question, but can I just say two things? Okay, so I think that as an educator, it's very important for me to reject certain lies that are told about what an education is and what colleges and universities are. And the reason why I think this is important to say is that this idea that we could have a room of people who agree politically but have nothing interesting to engage each other on is one of the myths about the liberal university. First of all, what liberal university? I would love to meet this place where it is open access and deeply democratic. There's people of color in high positions of power. Women are paid as equally as men. We have, really trans-friendly policies. That place doesn't exist. So we have to resist this idea that we don't have internal work to do, because once we buy into this caricature that we are these liberal bastions, we don't do any of the difficult work. I don't know about you, but if you've been involved in left or progressive politics, all we do is argue with each other about how we're going to make those politics real. So this idea that there is an echo chamber of people on the left, I have yet to meet those people, because every time I'm with a group of activists, we are really in struggle. And I think that when we minimize that struggle, we start to believe that we have nothing to offer. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. And the reason why I think history then plays an important role in it, my job in the classroom is to explain to students how I have come to a set of intellectual ideas. It's whether or not a student can join me on the train is irrelevant, but I need to be transparent about a process in which I have come to a set of conclusions, and they're so important to me, they have led me onto an intellectual journey, and that's what I want for them. And so if I say, folks, it's feeling like Reconstruction, I'm going to explain that. And they can decide if it is a coherent argument or not. But I think one of the dangers of these conversations in which we critique our institutions is that we start to devalue the very hard work of an intellectual process and then making that transparent to students. And so I think that I mean, I'm always a little uncomfortable with saying, this moment is just like this, but boy, do I like to say, what did the 1930s teach us about fascism? What did the 1960s teach us about what happens when a president calls for law and order, when an attorney general no longer is interested in investigating police excesses? What did those moments teach us? Well, let's think about that, and at the same time recognizing the one thing that is radically different is we've never had the demographics in this country that we do now. That is something new. And so, no, I have no problem saying that in a classroom and in this forum, because I know what I'm talking about, but because I make transparent that I read a lot of books and I engage. I don't understand why there is an assumption that our certainty is necessarily kind of uninformed dogmatism. It's not. It actually comes from a place. And the more we make that clear, the more we can resist this deep, deep, vast conspiracy to discredit the fact that we actually work.
Yeah, no, very good. Thank you. So Priyanka, I had the great fortune of reading an amazing essay you wrote last year in which you compared the mourning traditions in Hinduism alongside Du Bois's understanding of the Negro sorrow songs. And I'm curious in terms of how did that exploration into two very different cultures sort of inform your understanding of difference, particularly religious and cultural difference? And how does that shape your whole intellectual project so far?
Sure, yeah. So for some context, I took the theology course Problem of God with Professor Johnson last year, and for my final reflective essay, I explored my own family's Hindu traditions, our mourning traditions, and compared them with African American sorrow songs and West African folk traditions. So I'd like to begin answering this question by quoting a line from the sacred Hindu text, the Ramayana. So I'll say the line in Sanskrit first, and then I'll translate it for any non-Sanskrit speakers. So the line goes, Satyam bruyat priyam bruyat na bruyat satyam apriyam priyam cha anrutam bruyat isha dharma sanatana. And that translates to, speak the truth in such a way that should be pleasant to others. Do not say anything that is, do not say anything heartening to hear but is untrue. That is the path to eternal morality. So I'll repeat this translation one more time because it's quite powerful if you think about it. So speak the truth in such a way that should be pleasing to others. Do not say anything heartening to hear, but is untrue. This is the path to eternal morality. So I've grown up hearing this line quite a lot in my family. As a child, I didn't really question it much. I really interpreted this as, okay, always make sure to be on your best behavior, conduct yourself properly, don't offend anyone. But as of late in the past few years, I've really been meditating on this line and thinking about it, and really grappling with the concept of the messy truth. Any of you that watch CNN probably recognize that as the name of Van Jones's special program. So really, I've been thinking about, is it fair to make disenfranchised and underprivileged people have to censor what we say to make those in privilege feel comfortable? Though after really thinking about this line further, I realized that the crux of the argument lies in na bruyat satyam priyam cha anrutam bruyat. So this line doesn't give the license to tell lies. You should tell the truth in a pleasant way. However, do not say anything to make sure you appease anyone. There's really no need to appease anyone by diminishing the value of one's own experiences or other experiences. So really how you speak is just important as what you say. So I think really like looking at that line and also having like read Du Bois a lot, it's really interesting to think about how to strike a balance between how to be receptive and also not be offensive when talking to people, but also I think as Dr. Atashi was saying, how to be willing, how to basically transform the hearts of people in a kind way, but also be willing to be transformed yourself.
Yeah, thank you. And Shola, I'm curious in terms of this idea of transformation. I mean, when I went to school, that was the idea. Like you go, and I went to Morehouse, and there's an assumption that, well, we didn't know anything, and that we expected our teachers to give us this new knowledge. Whereas now it's a very different kind of context where we expect you to come in as sort of an engaged sort of participant. And I'm wondering, as an engaged participant, what does it mean then to advocate, particularly for issues around women of color, and to support the Black House in light of the sort of quote-unquote controversies? And some people, again, might say, without thinking through their argument, that, well, look, you're at Georgetown, take advantage of all the opportunities. And there's an assumption that if you are in the Black House or working with women of color, that somehow you're not taking advantage of all the issues. And I'm curious, how then does working with the women of color in the Black House give you, say, a broad platform to talk about issues that overlap and compete with a number of issues on campus?
So thank you for that question. I would say that when I first came to Georgetown as a freshman, so long ago, I did not have any idea of what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go. I'd come from a very stressful and very engaged. Just kidding, it wasn't very engaged because I went to a private boarding school in Connecticut. So I came from that environment and I came to Georgetown. I was like, I need a break. I need to sleep. I just want to go to class and I don't want to protest. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to see anyone. And I did that for a year and then I realized, you know what, this work is important and it needs to be done by someone. So I might as well jump in. So I joined the board for GU Women of Color, and that was kind of my entrance into what is activism? What does activism look like on a college campus? What does it mean to say you care about women of color? What do people think of when they think women of color? And you'll find that a lot of people think of Black women. And surprisingly, Black women aren't the only women of color. So I think having to go into that environment and learning more about what does it mean to be a Black woman, what does it mean to be an Asian woman, what does it mean to be a queer woman of color, what does it mean to be a trans woman of color, what does it mean to be a Black trans woman in America, and how all those issues feed into what does that all mean when you are on a college campus? So what kind of access do you have? What's the narrative that is being talked about when we talk about feminism? There's a lot of white feminism, which kind of hides a lot of the issues that affect women of color very differently. When we talk about reproductive rights, when we talk about the wage gap, historically, those issues have been very different within communities of color than they have for white women. And so when those issues, that's the kind of thing that I had to engage with and learn about. And unfortunately, those spaces weren't created for me in many of my classes. So I had to engage that with professors separately on my own, reading a lot of online articles, following a lot of Black feminism and Black feminist literature and texts. In terms of the Black House, this is my first and only year that I've lived here, and living in the Black House has been a real introduction into what does it mean to engage the administration of a university. What kind of things do they have to think about? How can I present the needs and concerns of students of color and Black students in a way that will make sense to them, in a way that is actually fiscal. I had to really change my mindset of Georgetown and really see it as a business. I had to think, what can the university afford? What is the university going to be willing to put money towards? Because at the end of the day, that's kind of how I had to change my mindset. Yes, I care about lives and students, but we are all dollar signs at the end of the day. So coming to that realization was shocking and kind of sad, but it helped me, and it helped the way that I changed presenting these issues, and it changed the way that I started talking about these issues to younger students as well. I think also being able to have a seat at those tables and using my positions as like a platform to elevate the voices of others has been a great privilege. And I think that we need more of that, especially when we have staff and faculty who might be able to enter into those spaces. But I think students also need to use their leverage to also work with staff and faculty who are here for a lot longer than 4 years. We cycle in and out, and we experience these things and are affected by what is happening for a very short period in comparison to the longevity of an institution. So when you work with those who have been here for 5, 20, 30 years, you get a very different perspective, and you'll see the waves of activism and the waves of change very differently. So I think engaging those conversations more with people who are here longer, talking about those issues more, and just sharing those different perspectives, having more conversations that don't just focus on one perspective, that don't just highlight one identity, because we are all complex and very intersectional people, so we need to have complex and intersectional conversations.
No, thank you. And Reverend Jim, I'm curious, can you say more about this idea of a moral crisis? You said in an interview recently that a nation is facing a moral crisis on multiple levels. And what do you mean by that? And what would you say from people who are like, well, what do you mean? This is about people who want their voices heard, people who are fighting for power, and people who want to see change. Why bring in morality into what appears to be a very political debate, an economic debate?
Yeah. Jesuit school, why bring in morality?
Yeah.
Teaching faith and politics at Harvard versus this school, it's interesting. Because Harvard, the idea that it's a liberal bastion, Harvard is as disconnected from poor and vulnerable people as any university. Mm-hmm. So when Marcia talked about history, that's important. For example, she mentioned the demography. The most important political fact in America, underneath everything else, is that by 2040, we're no longer a white majority nation. We're a majority of minorities. That's underneath immigration, it's underneath the Trump presidency, it's underneath everything. And the moral crisis is, how do we deal with that fundamental change that would allow us to, for the first time, be an exceptional nation, the first time? And how do you do that going forward? And she mentioned Reconstruction. It's important to say that Reconstruction was ended because it was working. In North Carolina, you had Western mountaineer white, non-slaveholding whites who joined with former slaves just released, put together a fusion party that connected the interests of white, rural, working-class people with slaves. And that was working, and they elected a governor, 2 senators, member of Congress, and it was shut down with white men with guns because it was working. And we need that exact thing right now, because those who are running the country and ran on bigotry and persuaded people that their grievances and resentments were because of other people when they weren't. So how do you have that conversation about those moral questions? If we're a Jesuit school, in this class yesterday, I had all the people that were between those two people I talked about before, very diverse, religiously, racially, gender. But the idea, when I had somebody present the principles of Catholic social teaching, this very diverse group, it was fascinating, the response. Because one of them is a preferential option for the poor. I never heard that at Harvard, right? And what does that mean here becomes the question too. Because what we said on the Hill yesterday was all the prophets say that a nation is judged, finally, in its righteousness or integrity by one factor, how it treats the poorest and most vulnerable. That's the factor. Now, that's the opposite of what's on the Hill, and universities have to deal with that too. So that's where a religious claim enters the conversation and changes the debate. So this isn't about being nice in a polarized environment. It's saying, what is the truth? Do we have any sense of, and one of the things that's, Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? That's a great question these days. The White House press corps is trying to ask the White House every day, what is the truth? What's fake news and what's the truth? So if you have a notion of truth and it's related to claims, then that creates a conversation different than left and right, liberal and conservative. So teaching faith and politics here is really different than teaching it at Harvard, in my experience. And I like the difference.
Okay. Well, I'm curious, Elham, I mean, how would you then bring together these very different voices? And based on your expertise, how do you bring, say, and again, I hate to use these sort of stark binaries, but say that, Hillary Clinton moderates and the Trump Republicans and the Bernie Sanders progressives, and you bring them into a room, what do you do with them? I mean, and how would you get them to negotiate with each other?
And just want to remind that we're in the post-truth world now,
Right.
How would you get them to negotiate? So I think the current political climate and the events leading up to the presidential election, we were presented with a perspective about life, that life is a series of deal makings, right? If you're not winning, you're losing. Right? And the idea is that, again, once this acknowledges this binary vision about you're either winning or you're losing, and these are the following things that you need to do in order to win. You need to destroy or outwin the other person, right, in terms of your views and your perspectives. And I think what another perspective and a different perspective will say, look, conflict, which is evident in people with different perspectives and viewpoints, is an opportunity for growth. If people view this opportunity as a way to come with each other and engage again with one another, I think it has a very, very different outcome that's not based on winners and losers, but how can we mutually benefit, right? Life is not a fixed pie. It's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not just the last pizza slice that we're all arguing over, right? But how can we come to one another, with one another, engaging with one another in a spirit that's not based on this binary vision of losers and winners, right? But as a way for mode of engagement that is based on discovery, right? Not for us to defend the assumptions that we have, but really to come to think about, as you were pointing out, how did we come to have these assumptions in the first place? Right? How do we want to view these assumptions, right? That we're not just defending them, but we are looking as in a mode of discovery of how we can collaboratively work with one another, not just to question these assumptions, but how we want to move forward, right, as a way to think differently about our assumptions and our vision for the future. And I think that provides us with a very, very different perspective in terms of how individuals can negotiate with one another. And once slowly, again, with this process of transformation and with commitment to engagement and relationship building and in the spirit of moving forward, I think you will find that participants will slowly move away from these positions that they have and into this interest of looking for collaborations and finding mutual ground of moving forward with one another. But that's, again, a very, very different pedagogy than this binary thing that we're currently stuck in of life is just about deal making. If you know how to make a deal, you're either a loser or a winner, right? And there's nothing in between, And I think we need to think very, very differently about this zero-sum game.
No, very good, thank you. And just sort of add, I want to just push in terms of, when I look across my classroom or look across the campus, I don't see this kind of engagement, that we are sort of advocating. And often I'm finding that my students are incredibly bright, they're great writers, great thinkers, but when you ask them to, say, just push the kind of narrative they've been given, it's a very difficult process because they're so used to defending what they've been received that it's hard then to break that sort of familiar zone.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if we have a context either at the university or in the church or the mosque that allows people to feel comfortable in releasing what is familiar and then and attempting then to engage different to the point they're willing to actually let go of something that they held as a truth. I'm not sure we have those kinds of spaces that will cultivate that kind of behavior. Do you want to, please?
I think that we have to really respect like loss and mourning and grieving in the process of relinquishing ideologies that even if they were harmful, they were really compelling. I don't know how many folks went in January. Derek White came to campus. He's the young man who was the feature of that article in the Washington Post, Why I Left White Nationalism. David Duke was his godfather. His father started Stormfront, and their family business was white nationalism, right? And when he came, the students asked me to moderate, and I was like, I don't know about this. But I said, I'm happy to moderate as long as we can actually talk about what it feels like to walk away. I'm not interested in, how racist it got, because I already know that. Like, the internet can tell us that. But what is it like to lose that? Because as insidious and disgusting as that community is, it is a community that gave him something. And in thinking about the grief that a young man leaving white nationalism will feel, I think it not only amplifies our capacity for empathy, but it also reminds us that people are having certain needs met. And if we ask someone to give something up, we have to give something other than that, right? And so he talked about how being in white nationalism, it was always the secret that he was waiting to get exposed so that he had to move on and make new friends that he had to hide the secret from. But he said that now that people know what his family was and now that he has a separation, he feels like he can actually have authentic relationships. And I think that that's something that students need to hear, because while most people are not coming from households in which your parents started a white nationalist movement, many of us are from communities and families or in relationships with people whose perspectives make us uncomfortable, and we don't know how to negotiate that discomfort. So if our students can see how this guy's walking away caused legitimate grief that can actually be honored, I think that some of those challenges that the students may want to surface in their own lives can also be thought of as not just about going to college and learning that you're right about something, but actually negotiating relationships that have other types of meaning.
Oh, excellent point. Do you want to respond, please?
Just that point about relationships, the people I've talked to that have left that world, it's not because they read something, right? They had new relationships. They were treated like they had never been treated before by people they didn't imagine being treated that way by. And so 75% of white people in America, 75%, have not one significant relationship or family of color in their social circle. Our racial geography, which is structural by policy, not accidental, separates us. So every black parent in America is afraid of her kids walking out the door in the morning. And most white parents don't know or feel that fear because they're not in relationships. So it isn't just white nationalists. It's a whole different expectation of culture. And I don't think, I love what Ellen said about negotiating. And you said before about school in a market economy. We got to not be ourselves a market economy as schools. And the notion, it's not negotiating or making deals between left and right. It's, again, the first principle yesterday, Catholic social teaching, is about the common good. What does the common good mean? And that really, I don't see the left or the right talking about. It's about deals and winning and losing, not about what, in fact, makes for the common good. And that is a way forward in our politics that deals with our real history right now that Marx is talking about, but also says we have some claims, religious claims, and we should be plural. My class is totally pluralistic, but they love the idea of the common good. They hadn't really heard that before. So how do we think about what does it mean to move toward the common good? Trump is not the cause, he's the result. And he's a backlash, the last death knell of white supremacy, I would say. So how do we fight that battle? But James Baldwin said in 61, I am seeing the death of white supremacy, but I don't know how long the funeral is going to last,
Do you want to please?
Yeah, can I
please,
respond?
Veronica.
Yeah, so speaking about relationships, I think it's especially interesting to look at across generations. Speaking from my perspective, I'm the daughter of Indian immigrants. I'm first generation Indian American. So it's really interesting to look at the way that I view a lot of issues today and how people of my parents' generation view a lot of issues. So, for example, like protest and civil disobedience are basically, I would call them requirements for a functioning democracy, and they're so important to Indian history and South Asian history in general. Though when people of my parents' generation who came over, 30 years ago, maybe a little less, they didn't really participate in that sense in this country because they had to really keep their heads down for the sake of keeping their jobs, keeping their position in higher education. So it's really interesting to look at the differences in how, like, I view a lot of issues today and how my parents view them, and how, I guess, this election and this backlash has really changed their view on things.
Yeah, and I just want to say that most people, when again you talk about this, how do we resist the current structures that don't allow people to focus on building relationships, or I like to think of it more as repairing the relationships that have been somewhere along the line broken. So, and again, they always remind me, they say, yeah, but civility is not a language of resistance. You know, we can't just be in a room and be civil with one another. We need to push these buttons so that we become uncomfortable, right? And I think another perspective to look at it when you were saying, I'm not seeing these spaces in universities where we've gone beyond just having conversations. And I think these days the word dialogue is being thrown so easily, every corner, everywhere. It's become almost like it's entered our language like never before. Everybody wants to do dialogue, right? But I think what's happening isn't really dialogue, right? Because dialogue is supposed to make you uncomfortable. It's supposed to make you shed these shelters that we have within ourselves that has protected these combinations of identities and ideologies that we've had, right? But if we don't become uncomfortable, then that's not really a space for dialogue, right? So I think, these spaces that we're seeking have to be constructed, right? They're not just there. They need to be constructed with a commitment that while civility may not be the language that we go in the room expecting, but it's also not the language that we go in there and not expect to become uncomfortable. It's time, I think, for us to shed all of these comfortable things that we have acquired, ideologies, nationalities, identities, as a way to have these visions that are transformative rather than just about change. Again, change is easy. Transformation, a little bit more tricky, because it involves a process.
No, thank you. So now I'd like to open it up to the general audience for questions and comments. And we have someone walking with a microphone. We have a question up front, sir. In the front. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Hi, thank you. I think I'd like to kind of continue with what Dr. Atashi was saying. And pardon me if I get this quote wrong from Martin Luther King, but he said something like, the extent to which you will be able to influence someone with opposing views is the extent to which you do not hold them in contempt. So, and I have the phrasing wrong, but that's the idea. And I actually came here because I'm trying to organize a little program of different methods that people can talk with. We're calling it contentious conversations. And the idea is, if you have a neighbor, a brother-in-law, an uncle, who, let's be honest, voted for Trump when you didn't, and I have just been avoiding the conversation when they bring up, rather than getting started, I just say, I don't want to have an argument. And I started, I can't do that anymore. I have to be able to engage them. So I'm part of a peace organization, and we said, really, if we could get together and just supply different methods and techniques to how do you engage, and I'll give one particular situation. I grew up in a very working class town, and I went out to dinner with some old friends from back home, and it was me and three of them, and all three of them had voted for Trump. And again, very working class. These were not rich backgrounds. And a couple of them made a couple of comments, and these are people I care about. We have a lot in common. We're joking around about the old days, or someone was going through a divorce. I didn't know how to engage them, and I was kind of avoiding because I didn't want to ruin the mood of this fun, old friends getting together. So my question is this. I hear from part of the panel the importance of holding our ground, and if we're progressive, we should be, fighting with, don't let them get too far, and we really have to hold our ground, and we may be all liberal and progressive, but we don't all agree, but still, versus what Dr. Atashi seems to be talking about is, or should we be engaging these people? And I kind of feel like we need to step up, and we need to learn, and we need to stop and engage. And I'm just wondering what response any of you, and I think Dr. Wallace probably, Reverend Wallace has a lot to say about that, but also if at the end, if any of you have any experience or know of any groups or techniques or anything doing this kind of thing, I'd be interested in talking to you. So thank you. I'm sorry I went on very long, but.
No, thank you.
Yeah, very, very quickly. So I think currently there's a lot of that going on. I think I can't tell you how many times I hear like, oh, look, I want to have the conversations, but I'm afraid we're not going to get along afterwards, whether it's students or even faculty or staff and friends, we're just not going to be friends, or I unfriended this person on Facebook. I'm not their friend anymore because they have very different views than me. And I think the idea is, if you, again, go into this as a process that requires you to listen to someone's story, right? Not with the idea that you're going to walk away necessarily agreeing with them, right? Or that you're going to walk away with you changing your position and your mind, but the idea that listening, that process that's dedicated to listening, right? And the desire for discovery rather than just defending presumptions, right? Is going to lead you to a place, or what I like to even think about is a space, because a space is open. A place, by the virtue of the word, already has boundaries around it, right? You walk into a place where at the conclusion of hearing their story, you're not necessarily saying, I agree with you and let's move along and let's come an outcome, but to really think about the impact of that story, of the story that's been shared, not just on your life or their life, but its consequence on everybody's life, right? And these exchanges of stories, right, then become not outcome-oriented, right, but really experiential rather than just, again, being focused on position, right? And the outcome of those story sharing and exchanges also become about things that we can then collaborate later in terms of finding interests, right, rather than just being focused on positions, which I think once you go into the process with a position-based, the outcomes already become very much binary, lose or win, But once you focus on exploration of interests based on that process, the outcome is going to be very, very different.
Okay. Thank you. Reverend Wallace?
One of my young staff did a video, he's our videographer, about what do you do when you go home for Christmas to talk to your Trump parents. And he got 2 million hits on this video. And one of these was, he said, oh, you say you didn't, these were like white evangelical parents, 81% of whom voted for Donald Trump. He said, you say you didn't vote for him because of his racial bigotry, but for other things. So I guess his racial bigotry wasn't a deal breaker for you. It got into a whole kind of conversation. And I think we got to talk to, white working class people who have been dislocated, and both sides of the aisle have been a part of that. It's more automation, though, than immigrants, right? So how do you have a conversation about what's going on with you here in the story? I agree that's important, here in the story, being empathetic to, but finding solutions to that story, and the blaming of the other, someone talked about, is what we're seeing now from Washington. So I think we can get under that. At the same time, you can't agree with everything. And when overt racial bigotry is expressed, you got to say no, And so, but honest conversations, there's a whole group, you mentioned groups, there's a whole new group I met this weekend called the Living Room Conversation. Mm-hmm. Living Room Conversation. And Joan Blades of Move On the left, and this Tea Party organizer, Mac Kibben on the right, have formed this thing. And another thing, 100 days, 100 dinners, my wife's going to, something like that, Tuesday night. So there are places where people are having that conversation. But where do you find, what do we have in common? What are our common values? Religious values, moral values, cultural values. Finding those places in common. I did a book once called God's Politics. Its subtitle was best, but why the right gets it wrong, the left doesn't get it. I still think when we're in a left-right conversation, we're stuck because the right and left are not defining the issues in any kind of what I'd call moral terms. So how do we get that better conversation going at a deeper level, rather than just being nice to each other with our different views? How do you go to a deeper conversation based on stories?
No, thank you.
Hey, thank you for the panel. This is great to hear all of your perspectives on all of these issues. But I wanted to go back to something that Professor Chatelain said earlier about the fact that this election didn't necessarily show the failure of democracy, but the endurance of white supremacy. And Reverend Wallace pointed out that, and that idea of white supremacy is something that speaks to certainly presidential election and the federal government, but it's something that also is part of a lot of our institutions. And Reverend Wallace spoke to the fact that in North Carolina, they built that movement that was focused on racial and economic justice and how that's such an important way to move things forward. So my question is really for the two students on the panel. How do you sort of see what students are doing now on Georgetown's campus in response to Trump's election, certainly, but how do you engage these questions of white supremacy in other institutions, including Georgetown? And both of you are in positions where you frequently encounter administrators and you work closely with the university, and I think you both challenge the university in a lot of really important, valuable ways. But how do you all sort of engage with that challenge while still feeling like you can call for the things that you think are important to make the campus a stronger community? So.
Do you want to go first? Okay, I can go. I would say that the term white supremacy is one of those very loaded terms that I think often shuts white people down because they're like, oh no, I'm not a KKK member, please, no. So I think that when engaging with the administration and Georgetown as an institution, I have to, and kind of just white people in general, I don't want to generalize, but it often is white people. I have to be very conscious and wary of the words I use. And so sometimes when I want to have an effect, I will say white supremacy and then be like, But other times when it's more of a casual conversation or it's more informal, I break it down more. So I talk more about how systems and everything goes into effect and kind of go through that process. And then when we can agree on those things, I'm like, yes, and that is called white supremacy. And so it doesn't quite hit as hard as when you just go straight to the word. I think in terms of engaging on a student level, like has been said previously, those conversations are very difficult and don't really exist. I think there's definitely a white mainstream Georgetown experience, and then there is the other Georgetown, whatever that may be. So whether it's the LGBTQ Georgetown, or whether it's the Black Georgetown, or whether it's the Latinx Georgetown, or whatever Georgetown space you frequent, you often have to navigate that Georgetown, and then when you go to class, you go to the white Georgetown, and then when you go home, you're back in your Georgetown, and just traversing those two spaces, it can be very hard to bring them together. And so I think that's when you go to events like this, or when you have opportunities where Georgetown as an institution is discussing diversity or issues of diversity, that's the time when they're trying to bring the two together. But I think we need to do a better job of prepping and making those who don't live in those other Georgetown spaces comfortable within those conversations, because you have basically your average, I would say, Georgetowner has maybe 1 or 2 experiences where they have to talk about diversity. Pluralism in Action, which is during the NSO weekend, and then surely they'll take 1 class where they'll have to talk about it, which will probably be through the diversity requirement. But outside of that, they're not really prepped, they're not really engaged. They might have like 1 or 2 friends of color who they might chit-chat a little bit about, but it's not going to go too in depth. And so I think we need more routes and more spaces where students who don't have to go through these conversations on a daily basis are able to have the language and the understanding and just like be open to having those conversations with other people. In terms of at an institutional level, the higher ups at Georgetown are still very white and very male, which is at many institutions. So I think just engaging with them and having to break down, what is the daily experience of a Black woman at Georgetown? What are the issues that we have to think about that you necessarily don't? And having to bring those to the forefront can be hard. I think Georgetown needs a bit more color and a bit more diversity in terms of like gender and sexuality, in terms of the higher up administration. And those conversations can then be more natural and be more current.
Yeah, so to add to that, I would tend to agree with the fact that we really do have to watch the language we use, not just when talking about white supremacy with white people, but in my experience also, in my experience with the South Asian community, with them too, I find that a lot of people are quite uncomfortable if I mention white supremacy, or a lot of people get very combative when I start talking about white supremacy, and it's been a really interesting experience for me to navigate that and to think, like as Shola was saying, like the different Georgetowns, like the white Georgetown, the Black Georgetown, the South Asian Georgetown. Even within that, I don't feel that I can go back to a Georgetown and feel like fully comfortable talking about certain issues at times, and it's quite unfortunate, but I think that's the reality of the situation. I think that's definitely changing now. A lot more people within the South Asian community are getting more interested in some kind of activism and seeing that South Asians especially have to mobilize and have to look at the different issues now, confront different issues such as anti-Blackness, which is quite prevalent in the South Asian community.
Just a word from a white guy about this. I mean, the most foolish question white people ask is, I'm not a racist, am I? It's like taking personal what is systemic. We got to get beyond the sort of, when white people feel uncomfortable, they feel like they're in danger, and they're not. They're just uncomfortable. And so, as was said on the panel, uncomfortability is a really important part of this process here. So what's in people's hearts is important, but what is the heart of policy is even more important. So did every white, and when I go to universities, I see a lot of, I'm not sure here, I've not been involved enough here in the broader school, but I see a lot of what I call drive-by diversity. There's the metrics are diverse and the rooms are diverse, but I have my alma mater, Michigan State, huge crowd of I said, look at you, you're so diverse, look at you, oh, wow. You ever talk to each other about race? Really talk? And they said, no. Well, let's do it here. It was diverse racially, religiously, gender, everything. And we had a terrific conversation. But that conversation, I find, I did Marquette a couple of weeks back, another Jesuit school, and it's amazing how little that conversation has gone on at Marquette. But we had a whole week about it, and not just by the metrics, but in terms of let's talk about systems and how the people who benefit from systems are responsible for changing them. That's the principle you got to get to beyond the guilt and shame is too easy for white people. You feel guilty and shame and go home and watch TV, But how do you take responsibility for changing systems? This is all systemic. So that kind of conversation, I find, it doesn't really happen in the sort of formal, as you said well, the formal diversity conversation. What does equity mean? Beyond diversity, what does equity mean? That's a conversation that every university has to have.
I'm sorry, I have to. Just one thing that I think we lose sight of is the fact that institutions are not equipped to do this, and most universities that try to do some type of broad-based diversity programming, it's usually done by people who don't know how to do it, and that's okay. I think that in the desire to suppress any type of critique or anything that looks like rage, institutions will try to program or pay their way out of accountability. But in doing that, they often undermine the very power of that work. And I say this deep in my heart, and I visit maybe 20 to 30 universities a year talking about these issues, that the one thing that I can say has been the greatest tool for me to do this work and to do a lot of healing of the racism that I've experienced is going to therapy, because I think that going to therapy teaches me how to be very clear about the impact that other people are having on me. And if it's something that you're opposed to, your spiritual practice perhaps can do it. If you are very codependent, 12-step groups like Al-Anon can help, because the dynamics that you learn in your household about not confronting authority, eating your feelings, and all of that kind of garbage that like stays with us the rest of our lives, we play out the same kind of sick roles when we think about these issues of race and justice. So that the idea of making other people uncomfortable is intolerable, that someone talking about psychic pain as a result of racism becomes intolerable to us, and we either want to silence them or we want to solve the problem. So I found personally that the more my psychological health became aligned with my social justice values, I was able to confront and discuss these issues in a place of integrity and with less fear than I ever have before, so that now when I go to a talk and someone comes up to me and they say a lot of vile, racist garbage, instead of saying, okay, and then moving on to the next person, I can be very clear and say, the impact you are having on me right now is something that you probably don't understand, but I will be unable to sleep as a result of everything you just said to me. And tomorrow I will try to have breakfast with my husband, but I won't be able to talk to him because your words will continue to ring in my ear. I will leave this space in a sense of sadness and despair that you have caused, and maybe it wasn't intentional, but I need you to understand your full impact and your power in order for you to make different choices in the future. And being able to say that took me like a solid 35 years of dealing with racism, but now that I have the ability to do that, I am less afraid of actually doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. My name is Danae Brinson. I'm a first year in the MSFS program as a graduate student, and also on the board of Hoya Circles, which works to do multicultural work here on campus. That is much needed. One of the things we've been talking about is a seat at the table, and one of my colleagues is here as well. And having these dialogues across difference, kind of a continuing dialogue. I think what we're concerned about is the people that we really want to access and have these dialogues with, they're not going to come to the table necessarily. And so I want to hear more from you about how to get everyone to the table, to have these dialogues, continuing dialogues, and also in the classroom, how we can help our professors, how we as students can help our professors, and how the professors can help have these conversations. I've literally been in classes where they just want to skip over slavery, or say, I literally had an economics professor say it was just a blip in our history. And that's a problem. And so I just want to hear from you about ideas on how to work through that.
I mean, I think, so there's two things that I think happen. I think that there's a lot of good intention and poor execution, and then something bad happens and someone says, well, this is what happens when we talk about difficult things. It's off the schedule. I mean, I think that that happens a lot. That for educators, we do our work in this really singular context, and so it doesn't occur to us to actually, and this is why Doyle is so good, right? You do this type of work in a cohort. So I think for educators, one of the grave mistakes that I see a lot of people make is that they're trying to do something difficult and they've spent no time building community. So if this is an important part of, even if you're one day, you know you're going to talk about slavery and you know it's going to be difficult. So starting the first day of the semester, you're building on moving the community towards the possibility of a really difficult discussion. It's like if I just met you and I ask you, how much do you have saved for retirement? You'd look at me and say, wow, what a bizarre question for this woman I've never met. So I know people who don't feel the need to connect with students, and then they want them to kind of rehearse the impact of racial trauma. It doesn't work like that. That's not how a relationship works. But on the student side, I think that professors need feedback about what is at stake, and they can make a choice about it. But I think that if they hear it enough, they also can kind of move toward something. And so if I was in that economics class and someone suggested that slavery was a blip, I would try to build a little coalition within the class to capture that information. And maybe on the evaluation at the end of the semester, I write nothing but slavery was not a blip. And if someone sees it 10 to 15 times, they might understand that that comment actually had an impact. Everyone wants to make a difference as long as it's good and it's amazing, people love you for it. But that's not how it works. And so I think that as educators, we have to get feedback on the negative difference we're making to undermine the goals of education. And I think that's the first step. It's unsatisfying, but I think that's the first step.
I mean, part of what I try to do is to sort of set a certain tone in the classroom, and it's difficult because, I come from a very conservative background, and the assumption, I think, and my teaching really sort of is a reflection of what I learned at Morehouse, and these were people who, went to some of the best schools for graduate schools but could not teach there because of race. And so they made places like Morehouse and Spelman and Howard sort of their haven. And there are certain sort of high expectations. But in the classroom, we knew that our teachers loved us, they wanted the best for us, but they also would give us a C when we deserved a C. And we knew that, wow, that was a hard-earned C because they really meant it. But they didn't see that as a mark of our being, but they gave it to us and said, look, we want to push you so you can actually do better. And so I've tried to emulate parts of that. And it's difficult because, as Marcia said so eloquently, there's a lot of trauma in the classroom. And I want to push students and show my own vulnerability and also tell them that, look, I want you to sort of challenge the sources I'm giving you so that you can develop your voice. But in developing your own intellectual voice, you have to engage these texts in a certain way. And I argue that I think to engage texts, and I think in a creative way, you must have a sense of your own traditions. And what does that mean? Well, I don't know. How do you define your traditions? Maybe it's your religious tradition. I mean, maybe it's this idea of where you went to school. Maybe it's part of your neighborhood. What are the habits you sort of grew up with? And I argue that once you have a sense of those traditions and how they're defining your framework, then you can come from a place of, okay, now this is my starting point. And then use that starting point to engage different material. And as you engage your material, who knows what will happen. But I think you come to the material with a bit more authenticity because you're not afraid of the starting question. You're not trying to hide anything. And you recognize what you know and what you don't know. So in that process, I try to then push students. And it's difficult because a number of students are, dealing with sort of emotional trauma. They're in therapy. And I recognize that certain texts are very difficult. But I think the more that I show vulnerability in the classroom, the more likely students are to take certain kinds of risks and to join in the conversation and to admit when they don't know something, but also to admit when they're wrong. But I think part of that assumes that we see the classroom as a community. And I used to say as a safe space, but I don't think it is a safe space because I think that's sort of a tall order. But I want to see it as a space where we can grow and challenge each other in very meaningful ways. And in the context of a certain kind of, I would argue, kind of political love, where I'm not trying to abuse you, I'm not trying to show you that I'm the smartest person in the room, but I'm actually trying to help you sort of reach your goals in conversation with my own research interests. So recognizing that they're competing interests, but they can come to a certain kind of common or at least somewhat common ground.
And I'm just going to say one last. It's also, I can't ask my students to do things that I'm not doing, and this is why it's terrible, because that holds you accountable. And so whether it's, I don't want tokenism in my classroom, so I'm not going to call on a student to be the perspective on something. I'm not going to only assign works by men. I'm not going to do certain things if these are not my values. I live on campus, so they see me also, and I also have a Snapchat now, which is fascinating. But I use Snapchat not because anyone cares what a middle-aged person is doing on the internet, but if my students are on Snapchat and I'm on Snapchat too, this is my olive branch. I will join you in this digital world I don't quite understand. And when they look on the Snapchat, I'm engaging in communities in different ways. They might find it terribly boring and a little sad, but what I'm saying to them is there's a series of values that I'm trying to surface in the classroom, and there's a series of things that are important to me. And if you follow me on my social media channels, that's what I'm doing, because I think what students are also desperately looking for is how does taking an integrative approach to your life look like when you're a grown up? Because if you're at a university that's infused with Jesuit values, does that mean you're a grown up who takes these values and lives them out? And what does that look like? And it is not glamorous. But boy, can they say, okay, this is what a consistent life looks like. And I think that's really important. And I think we all can find little ways to demonstrate that, with the level of comfort we have with it.
I'm stuck on your professor who said slavery was a blip. I'm just kind of stuck there. On the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, a lot of us marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge again. And we marched with all the foot soldiers who had literally risked their lives, John Lewis almost beat to death, on that bridge. And the president, first lady, the families, it was a very emotional moment. We got to the top, but it struck me as I looked over the bridge that I asked myself, what's our bridge? That was their bridge, literally putting their lives on the line for voting rights, which we now got to do again, because there's a systemic disenfranchisement that will be now done from Washington going on in terms of voting rights. Get ready for that. But it struck me that there's going to be a cost to walk across this bridge to a new demographic America. There's going to be a cost. It's not going to come easily. So Bryan Stevenson says, slavery never ended, it just evolved. And mass incarceration is a new evolvement of slavery. So with Bryan Stevenson, who's a very credible voice in America, that's got to be put back to this professor. There are history books being written in the South now that said slavery was migrant laborers. They're writing that history in the South saying that. So we have got, those blips can't be allowed to stand. Now I'm only an adjunct professor, visiting, whatever I am, but professors got to be challenged when they say stuff like that in class. And there's all kind of voices to come back at that. But we've got to, this is not going to be, building a bridge to a new America, as I say, is not going to be easy and not come without cost. So, that kind of statement can't stand at a place like Georgetown. Whoever said it, can't stand, can't be allowed to stand.
To briefly answer your question about engaging in conversation or having people who wouldn't necessarily engage in that conversation at different events, I think that's a very challenging thing to do, which I personally have experienced many a time. Food is always a great attractor for people. But I think also like coalition building, partnering with other groups who wouldn't necessarily have those kinds of conversations. I think particularly now we're in a time where different people are more aware of what's going on and do want to talk about these things, but they know they don't have the language or the capacity or the experience in order to have these conversations. So I think engaging with them and having those kinds of partnerships where you're like, this is what we're going to talk about. Also, I think bringing the conversation to them, like going to other events, and you can tie white supremacy and the patriarchy into anything, so bring it up. And I think over time, those will be integrated into discussion questions, and people will understand and see the connections into how, things do tie together, and how these conversations need to be had in spaces where you're talking about government or politics or economics or whatever the case may be, and not just a diversity conversation.
Is this on? It is? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's always bad when somebody gives me a microphone. Anyway, so I want to thank Marcia especially for you dramatizing that confrontation with that person.
All the time it happens.
All the time it happens.
Yeah.
No, so that
Yeah.
as a kind of model for something that I would imagine happens repeatedly, right? And the enormous work that puts on you and anyone else who confronts that repeatedly to do what you did, because that's exhausting. And I guess, so my thought through all of this that we've been sort of engaging with today, and this has been an amazing conversation, and I'm really grateful that I'm in this room. And it boils down to this, and it sort of goes back to Terrence's sort of very initial kind of catching himself either othering everybody who's not in this room, or the kind of person who wouldn't be in this room, back to a kind of more plural others, and already the sort of self-correction and the being nice and the sort of that gesture that we're always trying to make to sort of make sure that we're not the ones sort of engaged in the thing that we hate, right? But it's the thing that we confront every day. So my sort of hateful characterization of this, and I asked this to Eddie in the course of this conversation, is this kind of conversation happening in this place I'm going to call the other side? Is this happening at CPAC? Is this happening at Liberty University? And if it's not, and if part of what this is, and part of what you sort of, I think, unearthed in that dramatization, is that one of the things we're talking about here is how under attack we feel, and how much of this is really a kind of violence, and it's this personal violence, it's this sort of specific violence, it's local, but it is also systemic, and these work in tandem, and I'm just wondering what else needs to be in this conversation in a way that I think you opened up most resonantly for me, that again doesn't mean that we sort of need to figure out ways to be violent back. That's not what I'm saying, but I really think there's more to be sort of explored here at the level of like, how do we is there a larger sort of systemic programmatic version of what you need to do in every single instance in trying to still engage with a person who attacks you the way that you were attacked in that instance?
I think there is, and this is the part where academics start to bristle. I think that's why we have to be really vocal and use a lot of platforms to talk. I don't think sometimes the word public intellectual is used as a pejorative, like, oh, they're a public intellectual. That means they don't come up with ideas. But what they do is they reach a lot of people. So I went to Thomas Jefferson's other plantation called Poplar Forest, and I stayed at a hotel near Liberty University. And it was an interesting experience doing a talk about Black Lives Matter to people who are members of a plantation. But the reason I went there, it wasn't because I thought I was going to save the day, but if working at Georgetown makes people think I'm fancy enough to talk to a group of people, and I can be really clear about kind of what this movement is about, there's at least one person who's going to be less hostile, or there's going to be one person who starts to evaluate, oh, what does a Blue Lives Matter law really mean? Then that, I will take that as a personal victory, and I will encourage others to do it. And so I think that we have to be open to platforms. We have to be open to occasionally being a talking head on the news. And yes, you get really vile, nasty, well, when you're a Black woman, I don't know how other people get this, but when you're a Black woman and you do that, you get a lot of nasty, vile stuff. But it's kind of important because we have an opportunity to actually bring a really good conversation, and not to speak for others, but the marketplace will only allow so many voices. And I think that is something that we should all imagine the possibility, even as it makes us uncomfortable. And everyone can do it in their own way. But I mean, your point, Ricardo, I think is really important. If this conversation is not happening in another context, and maybe it sneaks in, maybe you're the one to sneak in that conversation, right? We get invited to do a lot of things to talk about one thing, but once you get the microphone, you can talk about whatever you want, right? Like, as much as we kind of reclaim because something is too important not to do it, I think we provide a little bit of that shift, kind of the giant boulder.
Yeah, disengagement is a position, right? That's tied to power, and it's tied to privilege, right? Those that disengaged are also making a choice, right? And I think making them conscious of that choice is also part of education. Is not just for the powerless, it's also for the powerful, right? And I think making them conscious of that choice is also important. I think in my interactions, I see most students go abroad and they really explore their identity of who they are by who they're not. And they wait to find out who they're not. They go abroad and they're like, well, I found out I'm white and I'm American. And I was asked, like, why is your country doing this? And suddenly I looked around me and they were talking to me. I mean, how could I be? And I said, but your being, the archaeology of your identity, the makeup of your identity means something when you step out of this environment, right, into a different environment, and then you put yourself in that position. It means something, right? Then you become answerable for all these things that you have comfortably stepped aside to, thinking they have nothing to do with me, right? All of a sudden, they get to explore all these uncomfortable places. What I like to see is that exploration of these ways of being and what each of these pieces mean happen in a very different space. But again, like I said, this word dialogue is being thrown in these days so sparingly. You can imagine if you're a student from the 10 a.m. class that you have, whether it's intro to economics, there's a separate section that says participation, right? And students are confused between participation, dialogue, exchanges, conversations, comfort zones, and I think, again, we need to be more comfortable with cultivating these spaces, nourishing these spaces, and making students understand that disengagement is a position that's tied to power and privilege, right? Those that are engaging, making themselves vulnerable and volatile to personal trauma, systematic trauma, right, are making a position as well, right? They're putting themselves out there. So disengagement is also a position, and often it's a position of those that have power and privilege so that they can disengage.
And maybe an encouraging word, we often get stuck with the national conversation, which is very depressing. But we just did a book tour turning into a town meeting tour, 30 cities, and the crowds were not just big and diverse, they were intergenerational. And we had grown-up, honest conversations, time and time again, cross-sector. And then I'd go home and turn on the news in the hotel room. And it was really depressing, but different than what I heard at the grassroots. There are a lot of things happening at the grassroots. 81% white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. Wheaton College, the premier leading white evangelical college, 50-50. At Liberty, you had students at Liberty attacking Jerry Falwell, the president, for his stance with Donald Trump. So it even you said the other side, evangelical Christian college, this conversation is going on at all those places. This is going on. So to me, what I see at the grassroots, whenever I'm out there, it's really pretty heartening and encouraging. A long way to go, but the right questions are being raised. The national level, it's a very controlled and polarized conversation. So let's not be defined by just what we see up here, but getting out around the country in all kinds of states, there's a better conversation going on. Standing Rock was such a powerful moment where indigenous people didn't just say we're the oppressed minority, they were acting as the stewards for all of us of this planet, saying here are the choices we have to make. And what happened at Standing Rock, losing the pipeline, which they're still not giving up on that, but even if we lose the pipeline, something happened there that changed the whole conversation around the country. So we can change conversations. Changing culture is what finally changes policy, but that takes longer.
Well, thank you for this incredible conversation. Thank you all for making time to come out. We know we have a busy schedule, many options. Thank our panelists and Michael Kessler and the Berkeley Center, and we look forward to more to come. Thank you.
I'm going to take just one more minute of your time to extend my thanks as well. My name's Eddie Maloney. I'm the Executive Director of CANDLES, the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship, and I'm really thrilled to be here right now. I'm also humbled and inspired by this talk. I feel a little bit awkward giving the final statement, so I'm going to just try to keep that to a set of thanks. A lot of people worked really hard to make this happen. My colleagues at the Berkeley Center, Tom Banchoff, Michael Kessler, we had, and my colleagues at CANDLES as well. So I'd like to thank them, thank the panel. I'm going to name a few names, and hopefully you'll join me in thanking them. So I mentioned Michael Kessler, Michelle Onona, if you wouldn't mind just standing when I mention your name, please. Michelle worked incredibly hard on this as well. Carly Henry, is she here? She left, okay. Claudia Winkler, no. John LaRue is also not here. No, Laura Dunn is not here. But the rest of the Berkeley family and the CANDLES family. So thank you so much for coming. One other note. When we have box lunches, it's a lot of work to clean up. There will be people cleaning up. So if you wouldn't mind grabbing your lunch and taking it to the trash, we'd really appreciate that. So thank you once again to the great panel. It was wonderful and inspiring. Thank you so much.